When Sarah and I moved into our new home, a grand, old Victorian, we thought we'd finally found our forever place. It was the kind of house I'd always dreamed of. The creaky wooden floors, the ornate crown molding, the kind of charm that only time could shape. We thought it was a steal, but we had no idea what lay hidden within those walls. On a chilly October evening, Sarah and I were setting up for a quiet night when I decided to head up to the attic to see if we could use it for storage. I hadn't expected much, just cobwebs and maybe some dusty boxes left by previous owners. But while poking around, I spotted a thick, faded tapestry hanging against one wall. I assumed it was just decorative, maybe a remnant of the house's past, but something about the way it hung seemed wrong. Curiosity got the better of me, so I pushed the tapestry aside, and that's when I saw it. A small, narrow door, almost invisible, tucked into the wall behind. My heart thumped. It looked like something straight out of a horror movie. I called for Sarah, and as she joined me, we exchanged an anxious look. "Should we open it?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Of course, we should have just left it alone. But we didn't. The door creaked open, releasing a stale, musty odor, as if it hadn't been disturbed in decades. A single bulb hung from the ceiling of the tiny room beyond, casting eerie shadows that danced across the walls. In the corner, barely visible in the dim light, was an old wooden chest, covered in layers of dust and grime. We knelt down, and with trembling hands, I lifted the lid. Inside we found a collection of old photographs and diaries, their pages yellowed with age, the ink faded but still legible. At first I didn't think much of them, but as I flipped through one of the diaries, something cold and heavy settled over me. The photographs were of a family, 2 parents and 3 children, but their faces were haunting, frozen in expressions of fear and something I can only describe as dread. Their eyes seemed to look right through me, pleading, warning. My fingers shook as I read the first entry in the diary. It belonged to a man named Edward, and he was clearly troubled. His words were written in a scrawling, almost frenzied script, each page filled with paranoid ramblings about how his family was conspiring against him. He described hearing voices at night, whispers that told him his family was plotting to betray him, to ruin him. The way he wrote about them, his own wife and children, sent chills down my spine. Sarah and I couldn't stop reading. There was a grim fascination in discovering the twisted secrets hidden within these walls. One of the final entries was written in shaky, almost illegible handwriting. Edward claimed he'd caught his wife and children conspiring, though he never said what that meant. He wrote about how he'd barricaded himself in this tiny room, seeking refuge from their betrayal, and that the voices were telling him to end it before they could get to him. The entries stopped abruptly after that, leaving us with a horrifying question. What had happened to Edward and his family? Over the following days, we combed through local archives, desperate to know more. We found a single newspaper article about Edward and his family, dated nearly a century ago. According to the report, they had simply vanished without a trace. No bodies, no explanations, nothing. As we continued to dig, things in the house began to change. We'd hear footsteps on the stairs in the middle of the night, and shadows seemed to flit just out of sight. Sometimes I'd hear Sarah talking, but when I called to her, she'd say she hadn't said a word. The line between past and present started to blur, and I felt as though the house was slowly closing in around us. One night, as we lay in bed, I heard a faint whisper, barely audible. It was the voice of a man, harsh, desperate. It was saying my name. Sarah heard it too. Her eyes went wide, and she clutched my arm as the whispering grew louder, more insistent. It wasn't coming from any particular direction. It seemed to echo from every corner of the room, surrounding us. I could hear my pulse pounding in my ears, and yet I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I barely slept after that night, and in the days that followed, I felt as though I was losing my grip on reality. One evening I found myself back in that hidden room, staring at the chest. The diaries and photographs were gone. They'd simply vanished. Sarah hadn't moved them, and I hadn't touched them. But they were gone, as if they'd never existed. We tried to ignore it, to live our lives as normally as possible. But every night, the whispers returned, growing louder, angrier. The walls felt colder, and the air grew heavier, as though the house itself resented our presence. I became consumed by an overwhelming feeling that we were intruders, that we didn't belong here. The breaking point came one night when I awoke to see a shadowy figure standing at the foot of our bed. It was tall and gaunt, its features obscured, but I could feel its gaze locked onto us. Sarah was frozen beside me, her eyes wide with terror, and then, in a raspy, bone-chilling voice, it whispered, "Leave." We left the house that night and never looked back. I don't know if it was Edward's spirit or something darker, but I do know that whatever haunted that house, it wanted to be left alone. Some secrets are meant to stay buried, and some houses, they never forget. I always thought of Uncle Tom as a simple man, the guy who made us laugh at family barbecues, who flipped burgers and told bad jokes, whose smile was as constant as the hum of the summer cicadas. But that all changed one summer evening when he vanished without a trace. One minute he was there, flipping a burger on the grill, and the next, he was gone. Just gone. It started as a family joke. Oh, Tom probably ran off to get more beer. But as minutes ticked into hours and the sun began to dip below the horizon, laughter was replaced by nervous glances, then full-blown panic. We searched the yard, the house, even the nearby woods, shouting his name, but there was no sign of him. The police were called. The search continued. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and eventually the endless waiting settled into the numb acceptance of an unsolved mystery. Uncle Tom was just gone. As the years passed, the edges of that mystery dulled, smoothed over by time, and my life went on. But that strange night, that hole left in the family by Tom's disappearance, remained like a wound that never healed. Years later, when my grandparents passed away, my father and I were tasked with cleaning out their old house. I was in the attic, dust thick in the air, when I found it. A small locked box wedged in a forgotten corner. There was a key taped to the bottom. Curiosity got the better of me, and I unlocked it. Inside I found a stack of old photos and letters. The photographs weren't the kind you'd expect to see in a family album. They showed my uncle in places I couldn't recognize. Distant, almost exotic-looking locations. He was surrounded by people who looked dangerous, with eyes that hinted at secrets. Men in dark suits and women with hardened faces. These weren't family vacation photos. This was something else entirely. Among the letters I found a few written in Russian. I didn't understand the language, but I knew enough to recognize some of the characters. It was then I noticed a small book tucked in the bottom of the box, an old leather-bound journal. The first page held Tom's familiar handwriting. For my nephew, in case the truth ever finds him. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. His words were cryptic, haunting. And that's when I realized this wasn't just a box of memories. It was a message, a warning. As I leafed through the journal, a story began to unfold. Uncle Tom wasn't just the guy we all thought we knew. He'd been a spy, a double agent caught between two worlds, one of them cloaked in shadows, the other masked by the warmth of family gatherings and summer barbecues. And I began to wonder if his disappearance had been as random as we'd all assumed. Maybe, just maybe, someone had silenced him. I was halfway through the journal when I came across something strange. A list of names and addresses, with the last entry showing our family home. My stomach knotted as I realized the implications. He'd been keeping tabs on us, protecting us, or maybe something darker. Later that night, alone in my apartment, I couldn't sleep. Every creak in the floor, every gust of wind outside felt like a sign, a warning. I lay awake, staring into the darkness, the journal heavy on my chest. It was around midnight when I heard it, a soft scratching sound at my window. My heart stopped. Slowly I crept out of bed and peered through the blinds. There was nothing there, just the wind whispering through the trees. But as I turned back toward my bed, something caught my eye. There, on my nightstand, where the journal had been, was a small folded piece of paper. I hadn't left that there. I picked it up, my hands trembling, and unfolded it. Scrawled in hurried handwriting were the words, "Stop digging." I dropped the note, as if it had burned me. How could anyone have gotten into my apartment? I bolted my door every night. I had no visitors. I even checked my phone's call history, but there was nothing. No calls, no texts. But I knew what I'd seen. Someone was watching. Someone who wanted to keep Tom's secrets buried. In the following days, my life became a living nightmare. Shadows seemed to lurk behind every corner. Strangers' faces in crowds looked vaguely familiar, like I'd seen them somewhere before. Maybe in the photos with Uncle Tom. A dark sedan began following me during my drives to work. And at night, that scratching sound returned, louder, closer, as if it was seeping through the walls. I wanted to stop. I wanted to burn that journal and forget everything I'd learned. But the mystery gnawed at me, demanding answers. Who was my uncle, and what had he gotten himself, and now me, into? One evening I decided I'd had enough. I would confront whatever this was, find whoever was following me. I grabbed a flashlight, the journal, and headed out to the street, where I'd last seen the dark sedan parked. The street was empty, silent. A voice whispered my name. A cold, breathy whisper that seemed to come from the shadows themselves. I froze, flashlight trembling in my hand. "David," it repeated, my name lingering in the darkness. I swung the light toward the sound, but there was no one there. Then a sudden sharp pain bloomed at the back of my head, and everything went dark. I woke up, groggy, in my own bed, the morning light streaming through the window. The journal was gone, and so was the box of photos and letters. But in its place was another note, scrawled in the same hurried handwriting. "This was your only warning. Let him remain buried." It's been a year since that night. I never told anyone. I buried the memory as best I could, tried to drown it in the monotony of my daily life. But sometimes, in the dead of night, I still hear that scratching at my window. My name is Robert Blackwood, and I never believed in curses. Not until I had no choice. My family's history was peppered with misfortune, a series of tragic accidents and untimely deaths that we often tried to ignore, laugh off even, as coincidences. But I know now some things can't be ignored. My great-grandmother, Eleanor Blackwood, was known for her beauty, her charm, and her fascination with the occult. Whispers say she was more than just an eccentric, that she'd traded something unholy, something terrible, for her beauty and influence, a pact with something malevolent, they said, and that it cursed her descendants. I'd never thought much of it until recently. My Uncle Harold had died, in a freak accident, crushed by a tree during a storm. My cousin Sarah drowned in the family lake, despite being an expert swimmer. I'd dismissed each tragedy as awful, yet explainable. But when I inherited the Blackwood estate, everything changed. The house was an old, sprawling manor, perched on the edge of the woods. It had an ominous presence even in daylight, as if it were watching me. The halls seemed to stretch longer than they had when I was a child visiting, and there was always this faint, oppressive cold. Still, I convinced myself it was just an old house, just my imagination, until I found Eleanor's room. It was locked, the key long missing. But one night, I heard whispers coming from behind the door, faint, like the rustling of silk against the cold walls, and I felt a chill down my spine. Something was in there. I dismissed it as an overactive imagination, maybe stress. But the whispers grew louder each night, almost insistent. The air around that door grew colder, as if the room itself was alive and waiting. One night, the whispers became clearer. I leaned closer to the door, barely breathing. "Robert." The voice was soft, coaxing. I stumbled back, heart pounding. I'd heard my name. It was impossible. Yet there it was. By then I couldn't ignore it. Something was calling to me, and I felt drawn to open that door. I asked around in town, hoping for some explanation. Old Mrs. Jenkins, who had been the family's housekeeper for years, told me something chilling. Eleanor, she said, had made a pact. That room was where she'd performed her rituals, and it was said that she'd left something behind, something dark and bound to the Blackwoods. Against my better judgment, I decided to break down the door. The air turned frigid as I stepped inside, like walking into a forgotten crypt. The walls were covered in strange symbols, faded but still powerful. In the center of the room there was a mirror, tall, blackened, and cracked, like it had seen too many secrets. I stood there, transfixed, feeling a pull from the mirror. It felt like it was looking back at me, studying me, and then out of nowhere, I saw her, Eleanor, staring back at me through the glass, her face twisted with a malevolent smile. I stumbled back, heart racing, my breath coming out in shallow gasps. Her voice filled the room, low and threatening. "Do you want to know the price, Robert?" she hissed. "The cost of our beauty, our influence, the things you cherish." Her voice grew louder, angrier, echoing through my skull. "The blood of your kin is my sacrifice. Your sacrifice. Each death, a payment owed for what I took. And now, you're next, Robert." I staggered backward, trying to escape, but the room seemed to close in around me. I ran down the hall, my mind reeling, but the whispers followed. They grew louder, filling every corner of the house, as if the walls themselves were screaming. For days after, I was haunted by her voice, her twisted face in every reflection, mocking me. Every mirror in the house seemed to hold her, her smile, waiting. The shadows in the halls grew longer, darker, as if Eleanor herself was lurking, ready to claim me. I tried leaving the estate, but something always pulled me back. The whispers, her voice, they followed me everywhere. And then one night, I heard something in the woods, the creak of old branches, the rustle of leaves. But then, a soft laughter. I saw a figure there, standing among the trees. Eleanor. I couldn't breathe. Her eyes bore into me, hollow and menacing, as if reaching for my soul. Now I understand the curse. I know what Eleanor's pact truly means. The blood of every Blackwood fuels her beauty, her power. She's bound to us, feeding off our lives, our deaths. I don't know how much longer I have, but I can feel her, closer each night. So if you're reading this, beware of family legacies. Some inheritances are best left untouched. And if you ever hear a whisper from the dark calling your name, run, because the Blackwood curse is real, and it's waiting.